Hey guys, tonight we begin with a city that everyone seems to romanticize. A city of marble columns and golden eagles and senators in crisp white togas debating philosophy in sun-drenched forums. A city that Hollywood has spent billions of dollars making look absolutely magnificent. And sure, if you were a senator or an emperor or even a moderately successful merchant with a decent villa and a few enslaved people doing your laundry, Rome was probably a wonderful place to live. But tonight, we are not talking about those people. Tonight, we are going to spend a long time with the other Romans, the ones history mostly forgot, the ones who lived in the cracks between the marble. The ones who woke up every single morning in the building that might literally collapse on them, ate food that might poison them, worked jobs that would destroy their bodies by age 30, and then stumbled home through streets so dark and dangerous that getting mugged was basically just part of the evening commute. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if this is your first time, welcome. This is a place where we talk about history in a calm, low, gentle sort of way, and if you happen to fall asleep somewhere between Roman sewage systems and grain shortages, that is absolutely fine. That is, in fact, the whole point. So dim the lights, pull the blankets up, close your eyes if you want to, and let me take you back about 2,000 years to one of the most celebrated civilizations in human history, and let me show you just how miserable it was for most of the people who actually lived in it. Let us start with a number. At its peak, around the 2nd century AD, the city of Rome had somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million people living in it. That is a staggering number for the ancient world. For context, most cities at that time had populations in the low tens of thousands. London, many centuries later during the medieval period, had maybe 40 or 50,000 people. Rome had 1 million. And the thing about having 1 million people crammed into a city that did not have electricity or modern plumbing in any meaningful widespread sense, or building codes that anyone actually enforced, or a fire department that could do much of anything useful, is that life at the bottom of that city was genuinely, deeply, almost impressively awful. Now, Roman society was divided in a lot of ways. You had your patricians at the top, the old aristocratic families who traced their lineage back to the founding of the Republic and never let anyone forget it. You had the equestrians, the wealthy business class, who might not have had the fanciest family trees, but had plenty of money and political influence. You had the plebeians, which was a broad and somewhat misleading category, which technically included everyone who was not a patrician, but in practice ranged from moderately comfortable shopkeepers all the way down to people who owned literally nothing except the tunic on their back. And then you had the enslaved population, which was enormous, and whose experience was its own particular kind of nightmare that we will touch on, but which really deserves its own entire video. Tonight, though, we are mostly focused on the free poor, the people who were technically Roman citizens, who had certain legal rights, who could vote in assemblies that increasingly did not matter very much, and who lived lives of such grinding, relentless poverty that the phrase bread in circuses was not a metaphor, it was literally the government's strategy for keeping them from rioting. Give them just enough free grain to not starve, give them just enough spectacle to not think too hard about how miserable everything else was, and hope for the best. The Romans had a word for the urban poor. They called them the proletarii, which literally meant those who contribute nothing to the state except their children. Let that sink in for a moment. The state's official classification for these people was essentially, they are useless except for the fact that they reproduce. That is not a nickname someone came up with as a joke. That was an actual census category. If you owned no property, if you had no land, if your total assessed wealth fell below a certain threshold, you were a proletarius. You did not qualify for military service in the early Republic because you could not afford your own equipment. You did not pay taxes because you had nothing to tax. You existed, in the eyes of the Roman state, primarily as a source of future population. Of course you did.
because nothing says we value you as a human being quite like being classified as a reproductive unit. And there were a lot of these people. By the late Republic and into the imperial period, the free poor made up the vast majority of Rome's population. Some estimates suggest that somewhere around 200,000 households were receiving the grain dole by the time of Augustus, which, depending on how you calculate household size, could mean somewhere between 600,000 and 1,000,000 people were dependent on government handouts just to have enough calories to survive. That is not a small social program. That is the majority of your city living at the edge of starvation and being kept alive by monthly rations of wheat. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us start where every poor Roman's day started. Let us start where they lived. If you were poor in ancient Rome, you lived in an insula. The word means island, which sounds almost poetic until you realize what an insula actually was. An insula was a Roman apartment building, typically between 3 and 7 stories tall, sometimes even taller despite laws that repeatedly tried to cap their height. The Emperor Augustus set a height limit of about 70 feet. Trajan later lowered it to 60 feet. The fact that they kept having to pass laws about this tells you that builders kept ignoring them. Because of course they did. There was money to be made, and the more floors you could stack on top of each other, the more tenants you could cram in, and the more rent you could collect. The ground floor of an insula was usually the nicest part. It often contained shops or taverns facing the street, and sometimes a relatively spacious apartment for a wealthier tenant. These ground floor apartments might have running water, thick walls, decent ceiling heights, maybe even a private latrine. They weren't luxurious by any stretch, but they were livable. The problem, of course, is that the poor did not live on the ground floor. The poor lived on the upper floors, and the higher you went, the worse everything got. The upper floor apartments, called cenacula, were small, dark, cramped, poorly ventilated, and built with increasingly cheap materials the higher you climbed. The walls got thinner, the ceilings got lower, the stairs got narrower and more treacherous. There were no elevators, obviously, and no railings on many of the stairways. The windows, if you could call them that, were small openings that let in some light and a lot of cold air in winter, and a lot of hot air in summer, and quite a lot of street noise at all times. Glass windows existed in Rome, but were expensive, so most poor tenants made do with wooden shutters or oiled cloth or simply nothing at all. There was no running water above the ground floor in most insulae. Let me say that again because it's important. If you lived on the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th floor of a Roman apartment building, you did not have a tap. You did not have a sink. You did not have a toilet. You had to carry water up from a public fountain at street level, haul it up multiple flights of narrow stairs, and hope you didn't spill too much on the way. And when you needed to use the toilet, you either walked all the way down those same stairs to use a public latrine, which we'll get to in a moment, or you used a chamber pot and either carried that back down the stairs to empty it, or, as was apparently quite common, you simply threw the contents out the window into the street below. The poet Juvenal, who lived in Rome during the late 1st and early 2nd century AD, wrote about the very real danger of walking through Roman streets at night and having the contents of someone's chamber pot land on your head. He was not joking. This was a genuine hazard. There were even laws about it, laws that assigned liability to the person who threw the waste if it injured a passerby, which means it happened often enough that the legal system had to develop a formal response to it. Wonderful.
The apartments themselves were furnished minimally, if at all. A poor Roman family might have a simple bed, perhaps a straw mattress on a wooden frame, or just a mat on the floor. They might have a small table, a few stools, some clay pots for cooking. There was no kitchen in any modern sense. Most upper-floor apartments did not have hearths or cooking facilities, because open flames in wooden-framed buildings packed tightly together were, as you might imagine, extremely dangerous. Some tenants used small portable braziers, basically metal pans filled with charcoal, to cook simple meals or heat their rooms. This was, of course, a terrible idea in a small, poorly ventilated space, and it contributed to both fires and carbon monoxide poisoning. But when your options are risk dying in a fire or eat cold food in an unheated room during a Roman winter, people tended to take their chances with the fire. And speaking of fire, let us talk about how often these buildings burned down. The answer is constantly. Rome had a fire problem that was, by any modern standard, absolutely catastrophic. The Great Fire of 64 AD, the one associated with Nero, is the most famous, but it was far from the only one. Major fires swept through the city with alarming regularity. The insulae were particularly vulnerable because they were built cheaply, often with wooden frames and thin walls, packed closely together with narrow streets between them, and filled with people using open flames for light and heat and cooking. When one insula caught fire, the flames could spread to neighboring buildings in minutes. The Roman fire brigades, called the vigiles, did exist, but their equipment was primitive by any standard, consisting mainly of buckets, axes, hooks for pulling down walls to create fire breaks, and vinegar-soaked blankets. They did their best, but their best was often not very good. If your insula burned down, you lost everything. Your home, your possessions, whatever savings you might have hidden under your mattress. There was no insurance, there was no government relocation program. You were simply homeless, standing in the ashes of what used to be your life, hoping that perhaps the landlord would rebuild and let you rent again, or that you could find another apartment somewhere else, which would require money you probably did not have because it had just burned up along with everything else. The philosopher Seneca wrote about people who went to bed wealthy, or at least housed, and woke up with nothing. He was being somewhat dramatic, as philosophers tend to be, but he was not wrong. And even when the buildings did not burn down, they sometimes just fell down. Structural collapses were another regular feature of life in Roman insulae. The buildings were often constructed hastily, with poor materials, by contractors who were cutting every possible corner to maximize their profit. The Roman author Strabo mentioned that collapses and fires were so common in Rome that they were practically expected. Cicero, writing about his own investment properties, casually mentioned that some of his buildings were in such poor condition that even the mice had moved out. He said this as a joke. It was less funny if you were living in one of those buildings. The landlords, by the way, were often spectacularly indifferent to the welfare of their tenants. Roman rental law was heavily tilted in favor of the property owner. Leases were typically short-term, and landlords could raise rents or evict tenants with relatively little difficulty. The Roman politician Crassus, who was one of the richest men in Roman history, made a significant portion of his fortune through real estate, and one of his most famous strategies was to show up at the scene of a building fire, offer to buy the burning property and the adjacent properties at a steep discount from their panicked owners, and then rebuild. He also owned a private fire brigade, which he would send to a fire, but which would not actually start fighting the fire until Crassus had finished negotiating the purchase of the property. This is historically considered one of the earliest examples of what we might today call a protection racket. Crassus was worth an estimated 200 million sesterces. His tenants were worth whatever was in their pockets. The system worked exactly as designed. So that was home. A cramped, dark, unheated, unventilated box on the 5th floor of a building that might burn down or fall down at any moment, owned by a landlord who did not care whether you lived or died as long as you paid your rent on time, with no running water, no toilet, no kitchen, and neighbors so close you could hear them breathing through the walls. Sweet dreams.
Now let us talk about food, because even in a miserable apartment with no kitchen, a person still has to eat. And the diet of the Roman poor was, to put it gently, not great. The foundation of the Roman poor diet was grain, specifically wheat, which was ground into flour and used to make bread or porridge. For much of Roman history, the staple food of the lower classes was a simple wheat porridge called pulse, which was basically grain boiled in water until it formed a thick, bland paste. You could add salt to it, you could add a little olive oil if you had some, You could add vegetables or herbs if you were feeling fancy, but at its core, pulse was just grain and water, and it was what the majority of Romans ate for the majority of their meals for the majority of Roman history. It was filling, it was cheap, and it was deeply, profoundly boring. As Rome grew and bakeries became more common, bread gradually replaced porridge as the primary staple. But the principle was the same. Grain was the center of everything. The Roman state understood this, which is why the grain dole, or frumentatio, became one of the most important institutions in Roman political life. Starting in 123 BC, when the tribune Gaius Gracchus passed a law allowing citizens to buy grain at a subsidized price, and expanding over the following decades until by the time of Julius Caesar and Augustus, grain was being distributed entirely for free to eligible citizens, the dole was the thin line between social stability and absolute chaos. The grain dole worked like this. If you were a male Roman citizen living in the city of Rome and you were registered on the official distribution list, you were entitled to receive a monthly allotment of grain, typically about 5 modii, which is roughly 35 kilograms, or about 75 pounds. This was enough to provide about 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day for one person, which sounds adequate until you realize that it was just raw wheat. You still had to get it ground into flour, which meant either grinding it yourself, which was exhausting manual labor, or paying a miller to do it, which cost money. And then you still had to get it baked into bread, which meant either using one of the portable braziers we talked about, which was dangerous and inefficient, or paying a baker to bake it for you, which also cost money. So the free grain was not actually free in practice. It required additional expenditure at every step of the process, and those additional costs could eat into whatever meager income a poor person was earning from day labor or odd jobs. And the grain dole only covered the head of the household. If you had a wife and children, their food was your problem. The dole did not scale with family size. 5 modii per month for a single man was manageable. 5 modii per month for a family of 4 or 5 was a recipe for chronic hunger. This is one of the reasons why malnutrition was so widespread among the Roman poor, particularly among women and children, who were often the first to go without when food was scarce. Beyond grain, the diet of the poor included whatever else they could get cheaply. Vegetables were relatively affordable, things like cabbage, turnips, onions, lentils, and chickpeas, and they formed an important part of the lower-class diet. Olive oil was a staple fat used for cooking, for dressing food, and even for lamp fuel. The poor used lower grades of olive oil than the wealthy, and by lower grades, I mean oil that was rancid, bitter, and probably tasted like something you would use to lubricate machinery rather than dress a salad. But it was calories, and calories were calories. Meat was largely a luxury for the poor. The wealthy ate pork, lamb, chicken, game birds, and elaborate meat dishes at their banquets. The poor ate meat rarely, and when they did, it was usually offal, the parts of the animal that the wealthy did not want. Organ meats, blood sausages, scraps from butcher shops. Street vendors sold cheap prepared foods from small stalls and counters called thermopolia, which were basically the ancient Roman equivalent of fast food joints. These places sold simple hot dishes, stews, porridge, sausages, and fried foods, and they were an essential part of daily life for the urban poor, many of whom had no way to cook at home. Archaeologists have found the remains of thermopolia all over Pompeii, complete with the large clay pots built into the counter where the food was kept warm. The food was cheap, it was hot, and its quality was, shall we say, variable. One of the most characteristic foods of the Roman poor was garum, which was a fermented fish sauce that the Romans put on essentially everything. Garum was made by layering fish, usually small fish like anchovies or sardines, with salt in large stone vats and letting the mixture ferment in the sun for weeks or months until it broke down into a pungent amber-colored liquid. The best garum, called garum sociorum, was made from mackerel and was extremely expensive, a luxury product traded across the Mediterranean.
The garum that the poor used was a much cheaper version, sometimes called a lek, which was basically the leftover sludge from the garum-making process, the bits of fish that did not fully liquefy, mixed with whatever else was in the vat. It was salty, it was strongly flavored, and it masked the taste of whatever bland or slightly spoiled food you were putting it on, which was of course the entire point. The water situation was another concern. Rome had one of the most impressive aqueduct systems in the ancient world, bringing fresh water into the city from sources many miles away. But the distribution of that water was not equal. Wealthy households could pay to have water piped directly into their homes through lead pipes. Public fountains provided water to everyone else, and the poor relied on these fountains for all their water needs: drinking, cooking, washing, everything. The fountains were fed by the aqueducts and were generally reliable, but the water quality could be questionable, especially in lower-lying areas of the city where stagnant water collected and where proximity to sewage and waste made contamination more likely. And yes, the lead pipes are worth mentioning, although the actual health impact of Roman lead plumbing is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. The interior of the pipes tended to develop a coating of calcium carbonate over time, which reduced direct contact between the water and the lead. So the lead poisoning was probably not as severe as some popular accounts suggest, but it was not zero either, and the poor, who sometimes resorted to collecting water from less maintained sources or storing it in lead-lined containers, may have been exposed to higher levels than average. This is one of those situations where the evidence is ambiguous enough that historians argue about it endlessly, which is honestly what historians do best. Wine was the other major beverage, and yes, the poor drank wine, but not the good stuff. The wine available to the lower classes was cheap, rough, often watered down, and sometimes doctored with additives like lead acetate, which was used as a sweetener. Lead acetate tastes sweet, which is why the Romans called it sugar of lead, and it was commonly added to lower quality wines to make them more palatable. This was, as you might imagine, extremely bad for you. Chronic lead poisoning causes neurological damage, kidney failure, reproductive problems, and a host of other delightful symptoms. And the widespread use of lead in Roman food preparation and storage is one of the factors that some historians have pointed to as a contributor to the broader health problems of the Roman population. Whether it contributed to the actual decline of the empire is a much larger and more controversial claim, but it certainly did not help. So to summarize, the diet of the Roman poor is grain porridge or bread as the base, supplemented by cheap vegetables, low-quality olive oil, occasional scraps of meat, fermented fish paste, water of uncertain quality from public fountains, and cheap wines sweetened with a known neurotoxin. Bon appetit! And the physical consequences of this diet were visible. Skeletal remains from Roman-era burial sites show widespread evidence of malnutrition among the lower classes, including stunted growth, iron deficiency anemia, dental disease from the grit in poorly milled grain, and signs of chronic infection and parasitic disease. The average height of lower-class Romans was significantly less than that of the wealthy, which is a pattern you see across many ancient societies, which was particularly pronounced in Rome. Poor Romans were shorter, thinner, sicker, and died younger than their wealthier counterparts. None of this is surprising, but it is worth stating plainly, because the gleaming marble city that we see in movies and textbooks was built on the backs of people whose bodies were literally being ground down by poverty. Let us drift now from the dinner table, such as it was, to the streets outside, because the streets of Rome were their own particular kind of experience.
If you step outside your crumbling insula, what greets you is not the pristine marble avenue of your imagination. The streets of Rome, particularly in the neighborhoods where the poor lived, were narrow, crowded, filthy, loud, and dangerous, and that was during the daytime. At night, they became something else entirely. First, let us talk about width. The main thoroughfares of Rome, the roads leading to the major public buildings and forums, were reasonably wide and well paved,
But the side streets and alleys in the residential neighborhoods, the subura and the other densely packed districts where the poor concentrated, were often barely wide enough for two people to pass each other without turning sideways. Some streets were so narrow that the upper floors of the insulae on either side nearly touched, blocking out the sunlight and creating a permanent twilight at ground level. These narrow passages were not paved with neat stone blocks like the major roads. They were often dirt or packed rubble, turning to mud in the rain and dust in the heat. The smell was, by all surviving accounts, extraordinary. Roman authors who describe the streets of the city's poor neighborhoods use words that translate roughly to overwhelming, nauseating, and suffocating. The sources of the smell were numerous and varied. There was the human waste thrown from upper floor windows that we already discussed. There was animal waste from the donkeys, mules, and horses used for transport. There was food waste from the thermopolia and shops, dumped in the streets or piled in corners to rot. There was the waste from various workshops and manufactories, tanners and fullers and dyers and metal workers, all of which produced noxious byproducts that were disposed of with minimal concern for the people living nearby. Roman fullers, who cleaned and treated cloth, involved soaking garments in large vats of human urine. This is not a joke. Urine contains ammonia, which is an effective cleaning agent, and the fullers collected urine from public urinals placed around the city specifically for this purpose. The Emperor Vespasian, in the 1st century AD, actually placed a tax on the collection of urine from public toilets, and when his son Titus complained that the tax was distasteful, Vespasian reportedly held up a coin and said, "Pecunia non olet," meaning money does not smell. This phrase has survived for 2,000 years, which is a testament to how memorable it was. The urine tax was a real thing, the fullers were a real industry, and the smell of their workshops was, by all accounts, absolutely vile. If you lived near a fullery, you simply lived with the smell. There was no zoning board to complain to. The tanneries were even worse. Tanning leather involved soaking animal hides in vats of various substances, including animal brains, animal feces, and urine for extended periods. The resulting smell was so powerful that tanneries were typically located on the outskirts of cities. But in a city as large and densely packed as Rome, the outskirts were still uncomfortably close to residential areas. And the runoff from these operations flowed into the streets and ditches and eventually into the Tiber River, which served as Rome's primary waterway and also effectively as its main sewer. The Tiber was not a clean river. It received the outflow of the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, which was an impressive feat of engineering, originally built in the 6th century BC and expanded over the following centuries. The Cloaca Maxima drained the low-lying areas of the city, including the Forum, and channeled wastewater into the Tiber. It was large enough to drive a cart through in some sections, and it was one of the things Romans pointed to with pride as evidence of their engineering superiority. And it was genuinely an impressive piece of infrastructure, but it was also essentially an open sewer that dumped direct waste into the river that flowed through the middle of the city. The Tiber was, by the imperial period, thoroughly polluted. Swimming in it was inadvisable. Drinking from it was worse. And yet, for people who lived near the river, particularly in the low-lying Trasteverium district, modern Trastevere, across the river from the city center, the Tiber was a constant, unavoidable presence, prone to flooding in wet seasons and leaving behind deposits of mud and sewage when the waters receded. Speaking of public sanitation, let us talk about the public latrines, because they were one of the few communal facilities available to the poor, and they were exactly as charming as you might expect. Roman public latrines were large, communal affairs, typically consisting of long stone or wooden benches with holes cut in them, arranged around the walls of a room, with a channel of running water beneath the seats to carry waste away. There were no dividers between seats. There were no doors. You sat next to your neighbor, elbow to elbow, and did your business while carrying on a conversation or reading or simply staring straight ahead and contemplating your life choices.
The latrines were not free. You had to pay a small fee to use them, which was another minor expense in a life full of minor expenses that added up to a major burden. And the cleaning implement provided was a sponge on a stick called a tersorium or yellowspongium, which was shared among all users. You would dip the sponge in a channel of water or in a bucket of water mixed with vinegar or salt water, use it, rinse it, and leave it for the next user. This was the standard hygiene practice. One sponge, many users. The potential for disease transmission was, to put it mildly, significant. Gastrointestinal parasites were endemic in the Roman population, and the communal sponge was almost certainly one of the vectors through which they spread. There were also public baths, the famous thermae, which were one of the genuinely good things about Roman urban life. The large imperial bath complexes, like the baths of Caracalla or the baths of Diocletian, were massive, architecturally stunning facilities that included hot baths, cold baths, warm baths, exercise yards, gardens, libraries, and social spaces. They were open to all Roman citizens, and the entrance fee was minimal, sometimes as little as a quarter of an os, which was a tiny fraction of a day's wage. Some emperors made the baths free entirely. The baths were one of the great equalizers of Roman society, a place where rich and poor mingled, at least in theory. In practice, of course, there were distinctions. Wealthy bathers brought their own slaves to attend them, their own oils and perfumes, their own towels and scraping implements. Poor bathers used whatever was available, and the water in the baths, while heated and circulated, was not chlorinated or treated in any way, which meant that the large communal pools were essentially warm, stagnant bodies of water shared by hundreds or thousands of people per day. The potential for disease transmission in this environment was enormous. Roman-era medical texts mention skin diseases, eye infections, and various other ailments associated with bathing. And modern scholars have noted that the baths, for all their social and cultural importance, were probably significant vectors for the spread of infectious disease. The Romans bathed to get clean, and they probably got sick in the process. There is a certain irony there that I think they would appreciate if they were not too busy scratching their rashes.
Now the streets at night. This is where things got genuinely frightening. And I use that word knowing that we are supposed to be keeping things calm and sleepy, but the nighttime streets of Rome were objectively terrifying, and there is no gentle way to say that. Rome had no street lighting. When the sun went down, the city plunged into near total darkness. The only light came from the occasional torch or lamp visible through a window, or from the lamp you were carrying yourself if you were smart enough to bring one. Most poor people did not have the luxury of carrying lamps because lamp oil cost money, and anyway, carrying a light at night just made you a more visible target. The Roman poet Juvenal, whom we have already met and who will be our cranky, sarcastic guide throughout much of this narrative, wrote extensively about the dangers of walking through Rome at night. In his third satire, he describes a nighttime walk through the city as a gauntlet of hazards. There were the chamber pots being emptied from upper windows, which we have covered. There were the carts and wagons because Julius Caesar had banned wheeled traffic from the streets during the daytime due to congestion, which meant that all commercial deliveries, all construction materials, all heavy goods had to be transported at night. So the dark streets were filled with creaking carts driven by cursing teamsters who could barely see where they were going. The noise was constant, and the danger of being run over was real. And then there were the criminals. Rome had no police force in the modern sense. The vigiles, the night watchmen, were primarily a fire brigade with some limited policing duties. The Praetorian Guard protected the emperor. The urban cohorts maintained order in a general sense, but in the back streets and alleys of the poor neighborhoods, at night, you were essentially on your own. Muggers, pickpockets, and violent criminals operated with relative impunity. Juvenal describes gangs of young men who roamed the streets looking for people to beat up, sometimes for robbery, and sometimes apparently just for entertainment. He advises his readers to settle their affairs and make their wills before venturing out after dark. He was being satirical, but like the best satire, it was rooted in truth. If you were poor and you had to go somewhere at night, you went quickly
You went quietly, and you hoped for the best. You could not afford to hire torchbearers or bodyguards as the wealthy did. You could not travel by litter, carried above the dangerous streets by teams of enslaved people. You walked, in the dark, through streets that smelled of waste and echoed with the sounds of carts and curses, and you hoped that tonight was not the night someone decided to relieve you of your purse or your life. And if something did happen to you, if you were robbed or assaulted, the legal system was not particularly interested in helping you. The Roman legal system was sophisticated and extensive, one of Rome's greatest contributions to civilization, but it was also deeply, fundamentally biased in favor of the wealthy. We will get to that in more detail shortly, but for now, suffice it to say that a poor Roman who was mugged in the street had very little practical recourse. Going to the authorities meant dealing with officials who were unlikely to take your complaint seriously, investigating crimes in neighborhoods they preferred not to enter, and pursuing perpetrators they had little ability to catch. Justice in the Roman streets was largely a matter of self-help, which meant that if you were big enough and tough enough and well-connected enough, you could probably take care of yourself. And if you were not, well, that was your problem.
Let us move on to something that occupied the waking hours of most poor Romans, and that is work, or in many cases, the desperate search for work. Because one of the defining features of poverty in ancient Rome was the precariousness of employment. There were no labor contracts in any modern sense for the lower classes. There was no minimum wage, there were no worker protections, no safety regulations, no unemployment benefits. You worked when work was available, and when it was not, you did not eat. Simple as that. The Roman economy was, in many ways, structurally hostile to the free poor. One of the biggest reasons for this was the institution of slavery. Rome was a slave society on a massive scale. At the height of the empire, enslaved people may have constituted as much as 25 to 30% of the population of Italy, and an even higher proportion in the city of Rome itself. Enslaved people did everything. They worked in agriculture, in mines, in construction, in manufacturing, in domestic service, in administration, in education, in medicine. They were skilled craftsmen, accountants, teachers, cooks, personal attendants, and manual laborers. And because they did not need to be paid wages, only fed and housed, which their owners did as cheaply as possible, they represented an enormous pool of essentially free labor that constantly undercut the earning potential of free workers. If you were a free Roman trying to earn a living as a construction worker, you were competing against enslaved construction workers who could be rented out by their owners at rates below what a free worker needed to charge to survive. If you were a free carpenter, a free baker, a free potter, you were competing against enslaved artisans who had been trained in those crafts specifically to generate income for their owners. This dynamic depressed wages across the board and made it extremely difficult for the free poor to find stable, decently paid employment. The jobs that were available to the poor were generally unskilled, temporary, and physically demanding. Day labor was common, working on construction sites, loading and unloading cargo at the docks along the Tiber, carrying goods through the streets, clearing rubble, digging ditches. These jobs were obtained by showing up at known gathering points in the early morning and waiting to be hired. If someone needed workers, they would come and select men from the crowd, negotiate a rate, and put them to work for the day. If no one came, or if there were more workers than jobs, which was often the case, you went home with nothing. The pay for day labor was low. A common laborer in Rome might earn somewhere between 2 and 4 sesterces per day, depending on the work and the period. To put that in context, a loaf of bread cost about 1 to 2 asses, there were 4 asses to a sestertius. A basic meal at a thermopolium might cost 2 to 4 asses, and monthly rent for an upper-floor apartment in an insula could range from about 40 to several hundred sesterces, depending on size and location. So a day laborer earning 3 sesterces per day, working perhaps 25 days per month if he was lucky, might bring in 75 sesterces, which was barely enough to cover rent and food for one person, let alone a family. Some of the poor found work in more specialized trades. There were fullers, tanners, butchers, bakers, porters, litter bearers, bath attendants, and various other occupations that, while not prestigious, provided somewhat more regular employment.
Craftsmen who had specific skills could earn more, but they faced competition from enslaved artisans and from freedmen, former slaves who had been manumitted and who often continued working in their former trades, sometimes still for their former owners. Freedmen occupied a peculiar position in Roman society, technically free, but still bound by social and legal obligations to their former masters, and they were often among the most economically active members of the lower classes, sometimes rising to considerable wealth, which generated resentment from both above and below. There were also less savory ways to make money. Prostitution was legal and widespread in Rome, and it was one of the few economic options available to poor women, who had even fewer employment opportunities than poor men. Roman prostitutes, called meretrices if they were registered, or prostibuli if they worked in the cheapest establishments, earned very little and worked in conditions that were, by any standard, degrading and dangerous. The cheapest prostitutes worked in small cells in the arches beneath public buildings, particularly the arches of the Circus Maximus, which is where we get the English word fornication from the Latin fornix, meaning arch. Of course we do. Language is wonderful sometimes. Street entertainment was another option. Jugglers, acrobats, musicians, and storytellers could earn small sums performing in public spaces. Begging was common, and while there was no organized system of poor relief beyond the grain dole, wealthy Romans were expected to practice generosity as part of their public persona, and some beggars could earn a living of sorts by positioning themselves near temples, public buildings, or the houses of the wealthy. The satirist Martial mentions beggars who had their regular spots and who guarded them jealously from competitors. Even begging, it seems, had its own territorial economics. And then there was the client system, the institution of patronage that permeated every level of Roman society. The patron-client relationship was a social bond in which a wealthier or powerful person, the patron, provided various forms of support to a less wealthy or less powerful person, the client, in exchange for political support, public displays of loyalty, and general ego-stroking. For the poor, being a client of a wealthy patron was one of the primary survival strategies. The daily ritual of the salutatio was central to this system. Every morning, clients would gather at the home of their patron before dawn, dressed in their togas, which were uncomfortable, heavy, and expensive to maintain, and wait to be admitted to the patron's reception hall, where they would greet him, pay their respects, and receive a small gift called a sportula. Originally, the sportula was a small basket of food, but over time it was commuted to cash payment, typically about 6 25 sesterces, roughly equivalent to 25 asses. This was not a huge sum, but for a poor Roman it was significant. 6 25 sesterces could buy food for a day or two, and if you could manage to be the client of multiple patrons and make the rounds every morning, you could cobble together a basic income. But the salutatio was not free in any real sense. It required time, getting up before dawn and walking across the city to your patron's house, often waiting for hours to be seen. It required a toga, which had to be kept clean and white, which meant regular trips to the fuller, which cost money. It required deference, flattery, and the suppression of whatever dignity you might have felt you possessed. Clients were expected to escort their patrons through the streets, swelling their entourage and making them look important. They were expected to attend their patrons' dinner parties, where they were often seated at separate, inferior tables and served cheaper food and wine than the patron and his social equals. Juvenal complained bitterly about this practice, describing scenes where the patron drank fine Falernian wine while his clients were given vinegar, where the patron ate fresh seafood while his clients were served scraps. The humiliation, according to Juvenal, was the real price of the sportula. The patron-client system was in essence a formalized structure of dependence and inequality dressed up in the language of mutual obligation. The patron got loyalty, political support, and a crowd of followers to make him look powerful. The client got just enough to survive in exchange for his time, his dignity, and his autonomy. It was not slavery, but it was not freedom either, not in any meaningful sense of the word. It was something in between, a gray zone of dependence that defined the daily existence of millions of Roman citizens.
Let us now float gently into the Roman legal system, which is one of Rome's most celebrated achievements, and also, for the poor, one of its most crushing instruments of oppression. And I do not use the word oppression lightly. The Roman legal system was, in many ways, brilliant. It gave us concepts that are still foundational to legal systems around the world. Things like the presumption of innocence, the right to a defense, the distinction between civil and criminal law, the idea that laws should be written down and publicly accessible. These are genuinely important contributions to human civilization, and the Romans deserve credit for them. But the system as it actually operated, in practice, in the courts and tribunals and magistrates' offices of the city of Rome, was tilted so heavily in favor of the wealthy and powerful that it functioned, for the poor, as something closer to a system of control than a system of justice. The most obvious manifestation of this was the formal legal distinction between honestiores and humiliores, which developed during the imperial period. Honestiores, meaning roughly more honorable people, included senators, equestrians, municipal officials, soldiers, and their families. Humiliores, meaning roughly more humble people, included everyone else, which is to say the vast majority of the population. These were not just social categories, they were legal categories that determined the punishments you could receive for committing a crime. If an honestior committed a crime, he might be fined, exiled, or, in extreme cases, sentenced to relatively dignified forms of execution, like beheading. If a humilior committed the same crime, the penalties were far harsher. Humiliores could be sentenced to hard labor in the mines, which was essentially a slow death sentence. They could be sentenced to fight in the arena, which was a faster death sentence. They could be crucified, burned alive, or thrown to wild animals as public spectacle. The same crime, the same evidence, the same conviction, and completely different outcomes based entirely on your social class. This was not a secret. It was a corruption of the system. It was the system. It was written into the law explicitly. And this disparity extended beyond criminal punishment into every aspect of the legal process. The courts were theoretically open to all Roman citizens, but in practice, navigating the legal system required resources that the poor simply did not have. You needed to know the law or hire someone who did. And lawyers in Rome, while they technically could not charge fees for most of the Republican period, were in practice compensated through gifts and favors, which meant that good legal representation was available primarily to those who could afford to be generous. You needed to be able to take time away from work to attend court proceedings, which could drag on for days or weeks. You needed witnesses who might need to be compensated for their time. You needed to be able to navigate the bureaucracy, which was complex and often deliberately opaque. And even if you managed all of that, the judges and magistrates who presided over cases were themselves members of the upper classes, people who lived in a completely different world from the poor litigants standing before them. The potential for bias, both conscious and unconscious, was enormous. A wealthy Roman accused of a crime could mobilize an army of supporters, character witnesses, and political allies to speak on his behalf. A poor Roman accused of the same crime stood largely alone, facing a system that was structurally designed to favor people who were not him. Debt was another area where the legal system bore heavily on the poor. Roman debt law was, for much of its history, brutally harsh. In the early Republic, a debtor who could not pay could be seized by his creditor, and, under the provisions of the 12 Tables, the earliest written Roman law code, could be held in chains, sold into slavery, or, at least according to some interpretations, physically dismembered and divided among his creditors. The last provision may have been more theoretical than actual, but the fact that it was written into the law at all tells you something about how seriously Rome took the rights of creditors relative to the rights of debtors. Over time, debt bondage was gradually reformed and eventually abolished, replaced with less extreme remedies. But debt remained a constant, grinding reality for the poor throughout Roman history. The poor borrowed money because they had to cover rent, to buy food during lean periods, to pay for funerals or weddings or medical care.
They borrowed from professional moneylenders who charged interest rates that could be ruinous. The legal maximum interest rate was set at various points at 1% per month or 12% per year, but enforcement was inconsistent, and actual rates were often much higher, especially for the smallest and riskiest loans. Defaulting on a debt meant losing whatever assets you had, which for the very poor meant losing effectively everything and falling into a deeper cycle of poverty and dependence from which escape was nearly impossible. The legal system also offered the poor very little protection against the abuses of the powerful. In theory, Roman law prohibited violence, fraud, and exploitation. In practice, a poor Roman who was cheated by a landlord, assaulted by a wealthy man's slaves, or defrauded by a merchant had very limited ability to seek redress through the courts. The power dynamics were simply too lopsided. Taking a wealthy person to court was expensive, time-consuming, and risky. If you lost, you might face countersuits or retaliation. If you won, enforcement of the judgment was uncertain. The wealthy had ways of delaying, evading, or simply ignoring legal rulings that they found inconvenient. The poor had no such options. This is why for the Roman poor, justice was less a matter of law and more a matter of patronage. If you had a powerful patron, someone with political connections and social influence, that patron could intervene on your behalf, use his influence with magistrates and judges, or simply make the problem go away through informal channels. If you did not have a patron, or if your patron was not powerful enough or not interested enough to help you, you were largely on your own. The law was there, technically, but it was like a beautiful marble building with its doors locked and its windows high above your reach. You could admire it from the outside, but getting in was another matter entirely.
Now let us talk about health. Because if everything we have discussed so far, the housing, the food, the sanitation, the working conditions, the legal system, has not painted a sufficiently bleak picture, the health situation of the Roman poor will certainly complete it. Life expectancy in ancient Rome is a subject of some scholarly debate, because the available data is limited and its interpretation is complicated. But the general consensus is that average life expectancy at birth was somewhere between 20 and 30 years. Now, this number is somewhat misleading because it is heavily skewed by infant and child mortality. If you survived to age 5, your life expectancy increased significantly, perhaps to the 40s or 50s. If you survived to age 10, you had a reasonable chance of reaching 60 or beyond. The average is dragged down by the enormous number of children who died in infancy or early childhood. And that infant mortality rate was staggering. Estimates vary, but something like 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 children born in Rome did not survive to their first birthday. By age 5, perhaps half of all children had died. These are numbers that are difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective, where infant mortality in developed countries is measured in single digits per thousand. In Rome, it was measured in hundreds per thousand. The leading causes were infectious disease, malnutrition, gastrointestinal illness, and the general unhygienic conditions in which the poor lived and gave birth. Childbirth itself was dangerous for both mother and child. Midwives attended most births among the poor, and while some Roman midwives were skilled and knowledgeable, their ability to handle complications was extremely limited. There was no understanding of germ theory, no antiseptic technique, no ability to perform safe surgical interventions. A difficult birth, a breech presentation, a hemorrhage, an infection, any of these could be fatal, and frequently was. Maternal mortality rates are even harder to estimate than infant mortality rates, but they were certainly high, probably somewhere between 1 and 5% of all births, which sounds small until you remember that women might give birth 5, 6, 7, or more times over the course of their reproductive years, each time rolling the dice. For those who survived infancy and childhood, the disease environment of Rome was relentless. The city was a petri dish. 1 million people packed into a small area with inadequate sanitation, contaminated water, shared bathing facilities, communal latrines, and constant exposure to waste and vermin created ideal conditions for the spread of infectious disease.
Malaria was endemic in the low-lying areas around Rome, particularly in the marshy regions near the Tiber. The Romans did not understand that malaria was spread by mosquitoes, but they did notice that people who lived near swamps got sick more often, and they associated the disease with bad air, which is literally what the word malaria means, from the Italian mala aria. They were wrong about the mechanism, but right about the geography. Tuberculosis was widespread. Gastrointestinal diseases, including dysentery and various parasitic infections, were common and frequently fatal, especially among children and the elderly. Typhus, typhoid fever, and other waterborne and flea-borne diseases circulated through the crowded neighborhoods. Skin diseases, eye infections, and respiratory illnesses were everyday complaints. The Roman medical writer Galen, who practiced in Rome in the 2nd century AD, described treating patients with a wide range of infectious and chronic conditions, and his writings give us a vivid, if sometimes frustrating, picture of the disease burden of the urban population. Roman medicine was, by ancient standards, relatively advanced. Roman physicians understood basic anatomy, could set fractures, treat wounds, perform some surgical procedures, and prescribe a range of herbal remedies. Military medicine in particular was surprisingly sophisticated, with dedicated field hospitals and trained medical staff. But for the civilian poor, access to medical care was limited and expensive. There was no public health service. Physicians charged fees, and good physicians charged high fees. The poor might consult cheaper practitioners, some of whom were competent and some of whom were outright charlatans, or they might rely on folk remedies, religious healing, or simply endurance. The temples of Asclepius, the god of medicine, were a form of religious healing that was popular among all classes, but particularly important for the poor, who had fewer alternatives. Patients would sleep in the temple, a practice called incubation, and hope to receive healing visions from the god. The temple priests would interpret these visions and prescribe treatments, which might include herbal remedies, dietary changes, exercise, or further prayers and offerings. Whether any of this actually worked in a medical sense is debatable, but the placebo effect is real, and the simple act of resting in a relatively clean, quiet environment away from the filth and stress of daily life may have provided genuine therapeutic benefit for some conditions. Epidemic diseases posed the greatest threat. Rome experienced several major epidemics during the imperial period, the most devastating being the Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 AD, which may have been smallpox, and which killed an estimated 10 to 20 million people across the empire, and the Plague of Cyprian in the 250s AD, which may have been a form of hemorrhagic fever, and which killed thousands of people per day in Rome at its peak. These epidemics were catastrophic for all levels of society, but they hit the poor hardest because the poor lived in the most crowded conditions, had the weakest immune systems due to chronic malnutrition, and had the least access to medical care or the ability to flee the city for healthier rural areas. When plague struck, the wealthy packed up and retreated to their country estates. The poor stayed and died. And when a poor Roman did die, the disposal of the body was its own grim affair. The wealthy had elaborate funerary rituals, processions through the streets, eulogies in the forum, cremation on costly pyres, or burial in grand tombs along the roads leading out of the city. The poor had none of this. The poorest of the poor were buried in mass graves, called puticoli, in open fields outside the city walls. These were not dignified burial grounds. They were dumping pits, places where bodies were thrown in along with refuse and animal carcasses, sometimes without any covering of earth. The stench was reportedly detectable from a considerable distance. Horace, the poet, described the area around the Esquiline Hill, which had been used as a burial ground for the poor, as a place where bones and scraps of flesh lay scattered on the surface. This area was later converted into gardens by Maecenas, Augustus's wealthy friend, which was nice for Maecenas, but did not much for the people whose ancestors were buried there. Funeral clubs, called collegia funeraria, offered one alternative. These were associations of lower-class citizens who pooled small monthly contributions to fund decent burials for their members. When a member died, the club would pay for a cremation or burial, a modest tomb or niche in a communal columbarium, and sometimes a funeral meal. These clubs were important social institutions for the poor, providing not just funeral services, but also a sense of community and mutual support. They held regular meetings, celebrated holidays together, and offered a social network that was otherwise largely unavailable to the urban poor. Membership was not free, of course, but the fees were modest enough that many lower-class Romans could afford them, and the security of knowing that you would at least have a decent burial was worth the cost.
Let us now drift toward one of the most famous aspects of Roman life for the poor, the spectacles. The bread and circuses that Juvenal so memorably criticized were not just entertainment. They were a political strategy, a social safety valve, and for the poor, one of the few genuine pleasures available in lives that were otherwise marked by grinding hardship. The grain dole, which we discussed earlier, was the bread half of the equation. The circuses were the public games, the ludi, which included chariot races, gladiatorial combats, theatrical performances, wild animal hunts, public executions, and various other spectacles that were staged at public expense and open to all Roman citizens free of charge. The scale of these entertainments was extraordinary. The Circus Maximus, Rome's largest chariot racing venue, could hold an estimated 150,000 to 250,000, depending on whose estimate you accept. The Colosseum, completed in AD 80, held about 50,000 to 80,000. Theatrical performances were staged in multiple venues around the city. By the 4th century AD, the Roman calendar included over 170 official festival days, during which public games and spectacles were presented. That is nearly half the year given over to public entertainment. The cost was borne by the state or by wealthy individuals seeking political advancement, and attendance was free. For the poor, the games were a central part of life. They provided free entertainment in a world where entertainment was otherwise expensive or unavailable. They provided a sense of community and shared experience. They provided a temporary escape from the realities of daily life, a few hours in which a poor Roman could sit in the same venue as a senator, watch the same races, cheer for the same charioteers, and feel, however briefly, like a participant in Roman greatness rather than just a spectator of it. The seating at the games was, of course, arranged by social class. In the Colosseum, the best seats, closest to the action, were reserved for senators and equestrians. The middle tiers were for ordinary citizens. The highest seats, farthest from the action, with the worst views and the most exposure to sun and rain, were for women and the poor. Even in the distribution of pleasure, the class hierarchy was maintained. But at least the poor were there. At least they were included. At least they could watch. Chariot racing was the most popular spectacle, and it generated passionate factional loyalty. The racing teams were identified by colors, the greens, blues, reds, and whites, and fans of each team were devoted with an intensity that makes modern sports fandom look casual. Riots between rival teams were not uncommon. The most destructive, the Nika riot of 532 AD in Constantinople, killed an estimated 30,000 people and nearly toppled an emperor, but that was in the Eastern Empire and a story for another time. In Rome, the rivalries were somewhat less lethal but no less passionate. For the poor, team loyalty provided a sense of identity and belonging, a way of defining yourself in a world where you otherwise had very little to define yourself by. Gladiatorial combat is the spectacle that most captures the modern imagination, and it was indeed a significant part of Roman public entertainment, although it was probably less common than movies and television suggest. Gladiatorial games were expensive to stage, and they were typically held on special occasions rather than as daily entertainment. The gladiators themselves were a mix of enslaved people, condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and some volunteers who chose the arena as a career, attracted by the fame and occasionally the fortune that a successful gladiator could earn. The fights were not usually fights to the death. Gladiators were expensive to train and maintain, and their owners had a financial incentive to keep them alive. Most fights ended when one combatant was wounded or exhausted and conceded defeat by raising a finger.
The decision of whether to spare the defeated gladiator was then made by the editor, the person who had sponsored the games, often with input from the crowd. The famous thumbs up or thumbs down gesture is probably a simplification of a more complex system of signals, and the exact mechanics are still debated by scholars, but the basic principle was that the crowd had a say in whether a defeated fighter lived or died. For the poor spectators, this was one of the rare moments in their lives when they felt they had actual power, the power to decide another human being's fate. Whether this was cathartic or brutalizing, or both, is a question that philosophers and historians have occupied for centuries. The wild animal hunts, or venetones, were another popular spectacle. Exotic animals, lions, bears, elephants, rhinoceroses, crocodiles, ostriches, and many others were shipped to Rome from across the empire and pitted against each other or against trained hunters in the arena. The scale of these spectacles was sometimes staggering. At the inaugural games for the Colosseum in 80 AD, the Emperor Titus reportedly had 9,000 animals killed over the course of 100 days. Trajan's victory games in 107 AD allegedly involved the death of 11,000 animals. Whether these numbers are accurate or exaggerated by ancient sources is debatable, but even if they are inflated, the actual numbers were clearly enormous. Entire populations of large animals were depleted across North Africa and the Middle East to feed Rome's appetite for spectacle. The Barbary lion, the Atlas bear, and the North African elephant all went extinct, at least in part because of the Roman games. For the poor spectators watching these events, the spectacle served multiple purposes. It was entertainment, obviously. It was a demonstration of Roman power and reach, reminding the audience that Rome's dominion extended to the farthest corners of the known world and could bring even the most exotic creatures to their doorstep. And it was a distraction, a deliberate and effective diversion from the daily miseries of poverty. Juvenal understood this clearly when he wrote his famous line about panem and circenses, bread and circuses, arguing that the Roman people who had once commanded legions and decided the fate of nations had been reduced to caring about nothing except their stomachs and their entertainment. It was a bitter observation, and not entirely fair, because what choice did the poor really have? They had been systematically excluded from meaningful political participation, denied economic opportunity, and left with no avenues for self-advancement. The bread kept them alive. The circuses kept them distracted. What else were they supposed to do?
And that brings us to politics, because one of the great contradictions of Roman society was that the poor were technically citizens with political rights, including the right to vote, but those rights were structured in ways that made them almost entirely meaningless. In the Roman Republic, which lasted from about 509 BC to 27 AD, Roman citizens voted in various assemblies to elect magistrates and pass laws. But the voting was not organized on the principle of one person, one vote. Instead, citizens were grouped into voting units, centuries in the centuriate assembly, and tribes in the tribal assembly, and each unit cast a single collective vote based on the majority within that unit. The centuries were organized by wealth class, with the wealthiest citizens grouped into the most centuries. This meant that the wealthy had a disproportionate number of votes relative to their population. The poorest citizens were lumped into a small number of large centuries that voted last, and voting stopped as soon as a majority of centuries had reached a decision. In practice, this meant that the votes of the poor were often never even counted. The election was over before they got their turn. The tribal assembly was somewhat more equitable, but it too was skewed. Citizens were assigned to tribes based on their place of origin or registration, and the rural tribes, which were numerous, were dominated by landowners, while the urban poor were concentrated in just 4 urban tribes. Since each tribe cast one vote, the 4 urban tribes, containing the bulk of Rome's poor population, were easily outvoted by the 31 rural tribes, which were dominated by wealthier rural landowners. The system was, in structural terms, designed to minimize the political influence of the urban poor while maintaining the appearance of democratic participation. Clever, in a cynical sort of way.
Political candidates did court the votes of the poor, because every vote helped in close elections, and there were various methods of winning popular support, including direct bribery, which was technically illegal but universally practiced. Candidates would distribute cash, food, or gifts to voters in their tribe, hire people to organize support, and make extravagant promises about public works, grain distributions, and entertainment. Some of this actually resulted in real benefits for the poor, particularly when populist politicians like the Gracchi brothers, Gaius Marius, or Julius Caesar championed land reform, debt relief, or expanded grain distributions. But these reforms were typically motivated by their personal political ambitions of the reformers rather than by genuine concern for the poor, and they were often reversed or undermined after the reformer in question was murdered, exiled, or otherwise removed from the scene, which happened with alarming frequency. With the transition from republic to empire under Augustus, even the limited political participation available to the poor effectively ended. The assemblies continued to meet for a time, but their powers were gradually transferred to the Senate and the emperor, and by the end of the 1st century AD, popular elections had largely ceased. The emperor now controlled the grain supply, the games, the military, the courts, and essentially everything else. The poor had no vote, no assembly, no meaningful way to influence policy or express their grievances through institutional channels. What they did have was the capacity for collective action, the riot. Urban unrest was a recurring feature of Roman life, and it was one of the few tools the poor had to making their voices heard. Food riots were the most common, triggered by shortages, price increases, or disruptions to the grain supply. When the bread stopped flowing, the people took to the streets, and the authorities took notice, because a mob of hungry, angry citizens could cause enormous damage and was extremely difficult to control in a city with narrow streets, densely packed buildings, and limited security forces. Emperors who managed the grain supply well were popular. Emperors who allowed shortages were despised. Claudius was reportedly mobbed in the Forum by hungry citizens who pelted him with bread crusts, which is a form of protest that is both pathetic and oddly creative. Claudius responded by investing heavily in the port facilities at Ostia and improving the grain supply infrastructure, because even a somewhat dim emperor understood that hungry people are dangerous people. But riots were a blunt instrument, effective at getting immediate attention, but useless for achieving lasting structural change. The fundamental inequalities of Roman society, the concentration of wealth, the exploitation of labor, the legal privileges of the elite, the exclusion of the poor from meaningful political participation, these were never seriously challenged by popular unrest. The riots got the grain flowing again, or got a particularly unpopular official removed, but they did not change the system. The system was too entrenched, too well defended, and too beneficial to the people who controlled it for any amount of street violence to overturn it.
Let us move now to something more intimate, the family life of the Roman poor. Because even amid all the grinding poverty and institutional oppression, people still fell in love, got married, had children, and tried to build something resembling a life. And the ways in which poverty shaped those most personal experiences are both touching and heartbreaking. Roman marriage among the poor was generally a simpler affair than among the wealthy. There were no elaborate wedding ceremonies, no dowries worth mentioning, no political alliances being cemented through matrimony. A poor couple might simply begin living together and be recognized as married by their community. Formal legal marriage, with all its rights and obligations, required certain formalities and was technically restricted by various social regulations, but for the most part, among the lower classes, marriage was a practical arrangement based on mutual need and sometimes genuine affection. Roman law gave the husband considerable authority over his wife and children. The concept of patria potestas, the power of the father, was a fundamental principle of Roman family law. The father was the legal head of the household, with authority over all family members, including technically the power of life and death over his children, although this extreme power was rarely exercised in practice, at least during the imperial period. A poor father's authority was, in practical terms, somewhat limited by the fact that he had very little to offer or withhold. He could not disinherit children who had nothing to inherit. He could not arrange advantageous marriages for children who had no social standing to leverage. His authority was real in a legal sense, but hollow in a material sense. Women in poor Roman households worked. This is worth noting because the idealized Roman woman, as described by the elite literary tradition, was supposed to be domestic, modest, and primarily occupied with managing the household. Poor women did not have the luxury of this ideal. They worked in shops, in workshops, in taverns, as street vendors, as laundresses, as hairdressers, and in many other occupations. Some of these jobs were considered respectable, others less so. But the economic contribution of women was essential to the survival of poor households, and the division between public and private spheres that characterized elite Roman life was largely meaningless for the poor. Children in poor households were expected to contribute to the family economy as soon as they were old enough to be useful, which was very early by modern standards. Roman children might begin working at age 7 or 8, running errands, helping in shops, learning a trade as apprentices. There was no compulsory education, and while some lower-class children might attend basic schools where they learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, most education for the poor was informal and practical, focused on acquiring the skills needed to earn a living. The treatment of children in Roman society is a subject that can be difficult to discuss calmly, because some aspects of it are deeply troubling by modern standards. The practice of infant exposure, the abandonment of newborn babies by leaving them in public places, was legal and apparently common in the Roman world. A father who did not want or could not afford to raise a child could choose to expose it, typically by leaving it at a designated spot, such as the columna lactaria, the milk column in the forum, where abandoned infants were sometimes collected by others who might raise them, often as enslaved people. The exposed children who were not collected simply died. The reasons for exposure were various. Some children were exposed because they were deformed or sickly. Some were exposed because the family simply could not afford another mouths to feed. Female infants were exposed more often than males because daughters were considered less economically valuable and because they would eventually require a dowry, however modest. A famous letter from a Roman soldier named Hilarion to his wife Elise, preserved on papyrus from Roman Egypt, instructs her, "If you give birth, if it is a boy, keep it. If it is a girl, expose it." The casual, matter-of-fact tone of this instruction is chilling, but it reflects a reality that was apparently widespread and unremarkable in the Roman world. Not all exposed children died. Some were taken in by other families and raised, sometimes as free members of the household, but more often as enslaved people. The moral and legal status of exposed children who were later found and raised was a subject of periodic legal debate, with some emperors ruling that free-born exposed children could not be enslaved, and others apparently tolerating the practice. The whole system was a deeply uncomfortable intersection of poverty, patriarchy, and the commodification of human life that even some Roman writers found troubling. The philosopher Musonius Rufus argued against exposure, calling it impious and unjust, but his was a minority voice. For the children who survived and grew up in poor households, childhood was short and hard. They were exposed to the full spectrum of urban misery from birth: the crowded housing, the bad food, the disease, the violence, the constant anxiety of economic precarity. They grew up fast, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. A child who could not work was a burden. A child who could work was an asset. The transition between the two happened early, and it was not accompanied by any ceremony or recognition. One day you were a child. The next day you were carrying water up 5 flights of stairs. That was how it worked.
Let us drift now into something softer, something that offered the Roman poor a measure of comfort in an otherwise uncomfortable world, and that is religion. The religious life of the Roman poor was rich, varied, and deeply personal, even if it did not always look like what we might expect religion to look like.
The official Roman state religion was centered on a pantheon of gods and goddesses: Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Minerva, and the rest, whose worship was overseen by a formal priesthood and celebrated through public festivals and sacrifices. These official rites were important for the civic life of Rome, but they were somewhat abstract and impersonal. The great public ceremonies were impressive spectacles, but they were performed by priests on behalf of the state, and the ordinary citizen was more a spectator than a participant. The gods of the state religion were grand, remote, and concerned primarily with the welfare of Rome as a whole, rather than with the individual struggles of its poorest inhabitants. For the poor, more personal forms of religion were more meaningful. Household worship, centered on the Lares and Penates, the guardian spirits of the home and family, was a daily practice in most Roman households, including poor ones. A small shrine, called a lararium, would be set up in the home, typically a small niche or shelf with painted or sculpted images of the household gods. The family would make small daily offerings, a bit of food, a splash of wine, a pinch of incense, and pray for protection, health, and prosperity. These rituals were intimate, personal, and deeply felt. They connected the family to its ancestors, to its home, and to the unseen forces that were believed to govern daily life. The poor were also drawn to mystery religions and cults that offered something the state religion did not: a personal relationship with the divine, a sense of community, and, crucially, the promise of a better afterlife. The worship of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, was hugely popular among the lower classes and women. The cult of Mithras, with its intimate underground temples and its emphasis on brotherhood and initiation, attracted soldiers and freedmen. The cult of Cybele, the Great Mother, with its ecstatic rituals and self-flagellating priests, offered an intensity of religious experience that the staid state religion could not match. And eventually, of course, there was Christianity, which grew from a tiny sect in a remote eastern province to the dominant religion of the entire empire over the course of about 3 centuries. Christianity's appeal to the poor is not hard to understand. It promised that the last would be first. It promised that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. It promised that the meek would inherit the earth, which was a much better deal than anything the Roman state was offering. It provided a community of believers who supported each other, shared meals, cared for the sick, and buried the dead. For people who had been told their entire lives that they were worthless, that they existed only to produce children and consume grain, the message that they were loved by God and valued as individuals was revolutionary. It is no coincidence that Christianity found its earliest and most enthusiastic converts among the poor, the enslaved, and the marginalized. Superstition, in the broader sense, also played a huge role in the daily lives of the poor. Belief in omens, curses, protective amulets, and magical spells was universal and deeply felt. The poor wore amulets to ward off the evil eye, a widespread belief that certain people could cause harm through envious or malevolent gazes. They consulted fortune tellers and astrologers, who operated openly in the streets and markets. They scratched curses on lead tablets, called deficciones, and buried them in the ground or threw them into wells, hoping to bring misfortune on enemies, rivals, or the person who had stolen their cloak from the public baths. These curse tablets are actually some of the most fascinating artifacts from the Roman world, because they give us direct, unfiltered access to the concerns and grievances of ordinary people. The curses are often mundane and specific. I curse Gaius Claudius, who stole my best tunic. May his fingers rot and his teeth fall out. I curse Tertia because she took my lover away from me. May she never know happiness. These are the voices of people who had no other recourse, no access to the courts, no powerful patron to intervene on their behalf.
They took their grievances to the supernatural because the natural world offered them no help. There is something both poignant and darkly funny about it. You can't afford a lawyer, so you pay a few coins for a lead tablet and ask the underworld gods to give your enemy diarrhea. It's not justice, exactly, but it's something.
Now, we have been talking primarily about the free poor, Roman citizens who had legal rights but lived in poverty. But we cannot fully understand the experience of the Roman poor without talking about the people who were, in many ways, even worse off, the enslaved. Because the free poor lived in constant proximity to enslaved people, competed with them for work, depended on them in various ways, and sometimes became them. The line between freedom and slavery in Rome was not as sharp as we might imagine. It could be crossed in both directions. Roman slavery was a massive institution. At any given time during the late Republic and early Empire, there may have been between 2 and 3 million enslaved people in Italy alone, and many more across the empire. Enslaved people came from many sources. Prisoners of war were the most dramatic, but people could also be enslaved through piracy, kidnapping, debt, birth to enslaved parents, or, as we discussed, through the exposure and collection of abandoned infants. The conditions of slavery varied enormously depending on the type of work and the disposition of the owner. Household slaves and wealthy families might live in relative comfort, eating the same food as the family, sleeping in decent quarters, and sometimes developing close personal relationships with their owners. Educated slaves, particularly Greeks, were valued as tutors, secretaries, and physicians, and they could live lives of considerable intellectual stimulation, albeit without freedom. At the other extreme, slaves who worked in the mines, on agricultural estates, or in other forms of heavy manual labor lived in conditions of extraordinary brutality, worked to exhaustion, chained at night, beaten for infractions, and discarded when they were no longer useful. For the free poor, the existence of slavery was both a source of anxiety and a source of perverse comfort. The anxiety came from the knowledge that the line between free and enslaved was permeable. A free person could fall into slavery through debt, through capture by pirates or bandits, or through the sale of their children. The comfort, such as it was, came from the knowledge that no matter how bad things got, at least you were free. At least you were not property. At least you could, in theory, go where you wanted and do what you chose. This was cold comfort when you were hungry, sick, and living in a building that might collapse, but it was something. Manumission, the freeing of enslaved people, was relatively common in Rome, and it created a large class of freedmen and freedwomen who occupied an ambiguous social position. Freedmen were technically free and could become Roman citizens, but they carried the stigma of former slavery throughout their lives and were subject to certain legal restrictions. They could not hold public office, for example, and they owed ongoing obligations to their former owners. Despite these limitations, some freedmen achieved remarkable economic success. The fictional character Trimalchio in Petronius's Satyricon is a flamboyant, extravagantly wealthy freedman who throws lavish dinner parties, and while the character is a comic exaggeration, he was based on real examples of freedmen who amassed great fortunes through trade, commerce, and industry. But for every Trimalchio, there were thousands of freedmen and freedwomen who simply joined the ranks of the free poor, trading one form of precarity for another. They were free, but they were starting from nothing, with no property, no social connections, and the enduring stigma of their former status. Their children, however, were fully free citizens with no legal restrictions, and this generational progression from slavery to freedom to full citizenship was one of the mechanisms by which Roman society renewed and expanded itself. It was also one of the things that made Roman slavery, for all its brutality, somewhat different from the racial slavery of the modern era. In Rome, slavery was not primarily based on race or ethnicity. Anyone could be enslaved and anyone could be freed. This did not make it less horrible, but it did make the social dynamics more fluid.
Let us now wander to a specific place in Rome that encapsulates much of what we have been discussing, the Tiber Island. the small boat-shaped island in the middle of the Tiber River that has been continuously inhabited for over 2,000 years and that served in ancient times as one of the few places where the sick poor could go for help. The Tiber Island was associated with healing from an early period. According to legend, a temple to Asclepius was established there in 291 BC, after a plague struck Rome, and a delegation was sent to the Greek city of Epidaurus to bring back the healing cult. The sacred snake of Asclepius, the story goes, slithered off the ship when it reached the Tiber Island and took up residence there, which was interpreted as a sign that the god wished his temple built on that spot. Whether or not you believe that a snake made a real estate decision, the temple was built and the island became a center for healing. The sick, including many of the poor who could not afford private physicians, would come to the island to seek treatment at the temple. The practice of incubation, sleeping in the temple precincts in hopes of receiving a healing vision from the god, was standard, as at other temples of Asclepius throughout the ancient world. The island also became associated with a darker practice. Roman slave owners, we are told by the historian Suetonius and others, sometimes abandoned sick or injured slaves on the island rather than paying for their medical treatment. The Emperor Claudius eventually decreed that any enslaved person abandoned on the island and who subsequently recovered would be granted their freedom. This was, by the standards of Roman slavery law, a relatively compassionate ruling, although the bar for compassion in that context was spectacularly low. The Tiber Island still functions as a medical center today. The Fede Bene Fratelli Hospital, founded in 1584, occupies much of the island and continues to provide medical care, making it one of the longest continuously operating medical sites in the world. There is something oddly comforting about that continuity, the idea that a place that offered healing to the poor 2,000 years ago is still doing the same thing today. Not everything in history is decline and decay. Some things persist. Let us talk now about what happened to the Roman poor as they aged, because growing old in ancient Rome without wealth was a particularly grim prospect, and it brings together many of the threads we have been following throughout this long, quiet narrative. If you were a poor Roman and you managed to survive infancy, childhood, disease, accidents, fires, building collapses, street violence, and the general hazards of daily life, and if you reached what the Romans would have considered old age, which was probably your late 40s or 50s, you faced a new set of challenges. Your body, worn down by decades of manual labor, poor nutrition, and chronic illness, was breaking down. Your ability to work, which was your primary source of income, was declining. And there was no pension, no retirement system, no government program for the elderly. Your options were limited. If you had children, you might hope that they would support you in your old age. Roman law imposed a duty on children to support their parents, and the family was the primary social safety net for the elderly. But if your children were themselves poor, which they almost certainly were, their ability to support you was limited. If your children had died, which was entirely possible given the mortality rates we discussed, you had no family safety net at all. If you were a client of a wealthy patron, that patron might continue to provide you with the daily sportula and occasional gifts, but patronage was based on the expectation of reciprocal services, escorting the patron through the streets, attending his events, swelling his entourage, and an elderly client who could no longer perform these services was of diminishing value. Some patrons were generous to their aging clients, others were not.
If you had been a member of a collegium, a trade guild, or funeral club, that organization might provide some assistance. But the collegia were primarily focused on funeral expenses, not on ongoing support for the living. There were no old age homes, no almshouses, no charitable institutions dedicated to the care of the elderly poor. The concept of organized charity as a social obligation would not become widespread until the rise of Christianity, and even then the resources available were limited. So an elderly poor Roman who could not work, who had no family to support them, and who had no patron willing to keep feeding them, was, in the most literal sense, on their own. They might beg, they might rely on the grain dole if they were still registered, they might find odd jobs that required less physical effort, or they might simply sit in the streets, slowly deteriorating until disease or exposure or starvation carried them off. It was not a dramatic end. It was a quiet, slow, invisible one, the kind of death that nobody writes poems about. The philosopher Seneca wrote about the elderly poor with a mixture of pity and philosophical detachment that is characteristic of how the Roman elite approached poverty in general. They could see it, they could describe it, they could even feel sorry about it, but they did not do much to change it, because the structures that produced poverty were the same structures that produced their own wealth and comfort, and questioning those structures was not something that Roman philosophy, for all its sophistication, was generally prepared to do.
Let us anchor ourselves in a specific neighborhood now, because Rome's poverty was not evenly distributed across the city. It was concentrated in particular areas, and the most notorious of these was the Subura, a densely packed, low-lying neighborhood located in the valley between the Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal hills. The Subura was, by all accounts, the roughest neighborhood in Rome. It was crowded, noisy, smelly, and dangerous. It was where the cheapest insulae were located, where the most precarious day laborers lived, where the cheapest taverns and brothels operated, and where crime was most prevalent. Roman writers describe the Subura in terms that make it clear they considered it the absolute bottom of the urban hierarchy. Martial mentions its noise and chaos. Juvenal describes its dangers. Propertius associates it with vice and degradation. And yet, the Subura was also vibrant, alive with the energy of people going about their daily business, buying and selling, eating and drinking, arguing and laughing. It had its own shops, its own thermopolia, its own temples, its own social networks. It was a community, however rough, and its residents had their own sense of identity and pride. Julius Caesar himself was born and raised in the Subura before his family's fortunes improved, and he reportedly maintained a connection to the neighborhood throughout his political career. Whether this was genuine sentiment or political calculation, it tells us something about the way the Subura was perceived, not just as a slum, but as a place with its own character and its own claim to being authentically Roman. The geography of poverty in Rome was shaped by topography. The wealthy lived on the hills, the Palatine, the Esquiline, the Caelian, where the air was cleaner, the breezes cooler, and the flooding non-existent. The poor lived in the valleys, in the low-lying areas near the river, where the air was stagnant, the mosquitoes bred, and the Tiber's periodic floods deposited mud, sewage, and debris in the streets and ground-floor apartments. This pattern of the wealthy living on high ground and the poor living in the lowlands is common across many historical cities, and Rome was no exception. Geography reinforced social hierarchy. The rich looked down on the poor, both literally and figuratively. The Transtiberem, modern Trastevere, across the Tiber from the main city, was another area associated with poverty and marginality. It was home to many of Rome's immigrant communities, including a significant Jewish population, as well as various lower-class Romans who could not afford housing in the more central neighborhoods.
The Transtiberine was connected to the main city by bridges, but was somewhat isolated from the centers of political and social power, which both marginalized its residents and gave them a degree of autonomy. It had its own character, its own culture, and its own problems.
And now, as we near the end of this long, quiet journey through the lower depths of Roman society, let us think about what the Roman poor left behind. Because one of the great tragedies of poverty in any era is not just the suffering itself, but the silence that follows. The poor leave fewer records. They write fewer letters because many of them cannot write. They commission fewer monuments because they cannot afford them. They appear in the historical record primarily as seen through the eyes of the wealthy, who viewed them with a mixture of pity, contempt, fear, and occasional romanticization, but rarely as fully realized human beings. And yet, traces remain. The graffiti scratched into the walls of Pompeii, a city preserved by volcanic ash in 79 AD, includes messages from people of all social classes, including the very poor. Some of this graffiti is crude, obscene, or simply silly. Gaius was here. Apollinaris, doctor to the Emperor Titus, had a good poop here. I don't want to sell my husband, not for all the gold in the world. These are the voices of ordinary people, captured in a moment of boredom or amusement or frustration, and they are as close as we can get to hearing the Roman poor speak in their own words. The archaeological record also preserves traces of lower-class life. Excavations of insulae at Ostia, Rome's port city where the buildings are better preserved than in Rome itself, give us a physical sense of what these apartments looked like, how small they were, how they were arranged, what objects were found inside them. Simple pottery, cheap lamps, iron tools, bone needles, game boards scratched into stone thresholds. The material culture of the poor is modest, but it is real, and it tells us about lives that were lived with whatever resources were available. The skeletal remains from Roman-era cemeteries tell their own stories. Short stature, nutritional deficiencies, healed fractures, signs of heavy labor, dental disease, parasitic infection. These bones are the bodies of people who worked hard, ate poorly, got sick often, and died young. They are the physical evidence of everything we have been discussing: the malnutrition, the disease, the grinding labor, the hazardous living conditions. When we talk about what it meant to be poor in ancient Rome, these bones are the most honest testimony we have. And the curse tablets, the defixiones, which we mentioned earlier, are perhaps the most personal artifacts of all. These small lead sheets, inscribed with pleas to the gods of the underworld, are the closest thing we have to hearing the frustrations, the jealousies, the heartbreaks, and the petty grievances of ordinary Romans. They cursed their rivals in love, their competitors in business, their enemies in the chariot races, and the person who stole their cloak from the baths. They are simultaneously pathetic and magnificent, the cries of people who had no power in the mortal world reaching out to the divine for help. They are, in their way, as eloquent as any speech by Cicero. So what can we take away from all of this? What does it mean to spend 2,000 years looking at a civilization and then to realize that for most of the people who lived in it, that civilization was not the gleaming marble paradise of popular imagination, but a grinding, exhausting, precarious, and frequently miserable experience? It means, I think, that we need to be honest about what we admire when we admire the past. The Romans built aqueducts and roads and temples and legal codes that shaped the world. They created a political and military system that lasted for centuries and whose influence is still felt today. These are genuine achievements, and they deserve recognition. But they were achieved at an enormous human cost, and that cost was borne disproportionately by the people at the bottom,
the people who carried the water, ground the grain, built the buildings, cleaned the streets, and buried the dead. These people were not heroes of history. They were not great leaders or brilliant generals or innovative thinkers. They were just people, trying to get through the day, trying to feed their families, trying to stay alive in a city that did not care very much whether they lived or died. And in that, they were not so different from the poor in any time or place. The specific details change. The insulae become tenements, the grain dole becomes food stamps, the subura becomes the wrong side of the tracks, but the fundamental experience of poverty, the precarity, the exhaustion, the invisibility, the quiet desperation is remarkably constant across time and space. History, for all its grand narratives of empires and battles and revolutions, is mostly the story of ordinary people trying to survive, and the story of how the systems they lived under made that survival harder or easier. The Roman poor survived, many of them anyway. They got through the day, and the next day, and the one after that. They ate their porridge and drank their cheap wine and went to the chariot races and scratched curses on lead tablets and raised their children and buried their dead and got up in the morning and did it all over again. They did not change the world. They did not build the monuments. They are not in the textbooks. But they were there. They were the majority, and their lives mattered, even if the people who wrote the history did not always think so. And on that quiet note, I think we have come to a natural resting place. The oil lamp is burning low. The city outside is doing whatever the city does at this hour, which is mostly involve carts and chamber pots and stray dogs. And you, I hope, are somewhere warm and comfortable and safe and possibly already asleep, which means this whole script has done exactly what it was supposed to do. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And the next time someone talks about the glory of Rome, maybe spare a thought for the people on the 5th floor, hauling water up the stairs, hoping the building does not catch fire, and wondering what's in tonight's porridge. Good night.